There should be on your chairs as well, there's an outline of what we're doing during the week. So we're here each lunchtime. And the reason we're starting with this question is that the rest of the week we will be encouraging you to look at the accounts of Jesus' life, John's Gospel in particular, and asking you to make life decisions based on what people say about Jesus. So we thought we'd start the week with looking at whether you should take that seriously or not, whether this is just sort of fairy story stuff, or whether you can have good reasons to take seriously what it says in those books. So my aim today is not to move you to what I think about the Bible. So I think the Bible is true, I think it's God speaking, but I'm not hoping to get you that far in this space of time. I hope to get you to a point where you'll treat the Bible, or the Gospels in particular, the 4 New Testament Gospels, as you would any other ancient historical book. So you'd read them, you'd think, I wonder if this is true or not. I wonder what the biases are. I wonder what really happened. So you take them seriously, but then ask lots of true or false questions afterwards. You can see in the handout, sorry the handout is very geeky. I wrote this handout, and we're not going to go through it all in detail. Okay, so please relax. This is for you to take away so you can keep reading more about this afterwards. But you'll see just the quotes at the top there. There's a quote from the end of John's Gospel where someone else has added to John's Gospel, this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. So that's a claim from an early Christian community about the person who wrote John. We know who it was, it's reliable testimony, it's true. That's one claim. Then I put Richard Dawkins, Professor Dawkins on there as well, who says this: the fact that something is written down is persuasive to people not used to asking questions. So he means idiots, basically. Questions like, who wrote it and when? How did they know what to write? Did they in their time really mean what we in our time understand them to be saying? Were they unbiased observers, or did they have an agenda that coloured their writing? And those questions that he thinks would destroy Christianity, basically, those are very, very normal historical questions that you'd ask about any event and any book. And they're so normal that just after I finished my undergrad history degree, I wrote this handout for the first time in the summer afterwards. It was before Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion, I Am That Old, and you'll see that what I did was just go basically through his questions, even before he'd written that. They're the questions that Christians have been asking and answering for hundreds of years, and the New Testament Gospels come out very well. When you ask those questions compared to other ancient books, the New Testament Gospels come out very well. We're going to take them in what I hope is a logical order. So you can imagine if an unusual event were to happen here today, so if Don were to suddenly leap from his seat and knock me out with a big punch to the nose, that would be a reasonably unusual event. And you can, I guess, not quite as unusual as the events in Jesus' life, but an unusual event. You can imagine the kind of story spreading, and then the student newspaper getting hold of it and interviewing you about the time when Don punched Charlie, and then maybe years later in the history of guys, there would be this kind of entry with a kind of cut-out bit of the newspaper with the day that Don punched Charlie. Okay, so the kind of stage is in from unusual events through to recorded history. That's what we're roughly going to follow through as we go. So first question on there, do we have what was actually written by the New Testament authors? Lots of people think that what you've got on your chair, you've got John's Gospel there on your chair free for you to take away. People think that's just been changed and distorted over hundreds of years of kind of mishmash, and we've really no idea what they originally wrote. To work this one out, we need to compare the Gospels with other books written at the same period of time. So if Don punched me, it would actually be recorded on 2 separate digital media there. That'd be quite helpful. But when Jesus was doing what Jesus was doing, there was no Sky News, there's no video recording. So we need to compare the Gospels to other ancient books. And I put some kind of closest possible comparisons on there for you. We've got a Jewish book written in a very similar period. And just look at what I put there about Tacitus. Tacitus I had to read and translate when I was trying to learn Latin when I was younger. And it's an excellent source for Roman history at the same sort of period as Jesus' time. And you'll see that the first third of his book we only have one manuscript for, and the manuscript is from 850 AD. when he was actually writing in 115 AD. You'll see for the middle third of his book, we've just lost it. Books are fragile, they get destroyed and burned and lost. And then the final third of his book, we've got one manuscript from the 11th century. And that is normal, and nobody would discredit Tacitus because of that. That's just what it is like in the ancient world. Whereas the New Testament is different to that, which is not for any kind of weird God reason, I don't think. That's just because the New Testament was the most popular book in the Middle Ages. So they copied it and copied it and copied it and kept and looked after the books that they had, so that we have something like 5,000 would be a good estimate of pieces, fragments, and copies of the New Testament from the same sort of period as those kind of Tacitus copies that I've given there as well. That means that we can resolve any differences between the manuscripts, and there are lots, but we can resolve them and work out which one was the original reading. So that in any normal Bible, not actually the cheap Bibles on your seats, but any normal Bible, you'd get a footnote of the bits that we're not sure about. And it'd be things like place names, or whether Jesus repeated himself in a paragraph, or whether he just said something once. It's that kind of thing as a normal example. The biggest example in the book you've got there is in John chapter 11, the first chunk in John chapter, sorry, I don't mean John chapter 11. The woman who's caught in adultery. Where is that? John chapter 9. No, 8. There you go. Thank you. And that'll be marked, even in your budget version, as the earliest manuscripts don't have this. So that's the kind of the most significant. There's one at the end of Mark as well. Then, when have we got copies from? And if you turn the page to page 2, we can just work backwards in time. So you could go up to where the British Museum keeps its most exciting books, and you could look in the British Library near Euston, and you can see Codex Sinaiticus, which is a complete Old and New Testament from 350 AD. And you could, if you spoke enough Greek, you could compare that to the John's Gospel we've just given you and see how very, very close it is to that. If you want to go further back in time, you could go to Dublin, 100 years earlier, and see most of the New Testament. Then you could even, if you wanted to go to Manchester and get special permission, you could look at bits and pieces as close as 125 AD to the writing of John. And beyond that as well, the early Christians liked the Bible, liked the Gospels, so they quoted from them. And this is the index to Irenaeus, who's writing inside the 2nd century, and he's quoted Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, lots and lots of times. So we can compare what we have now with what was originally written, and come down to very, very good confidence that what we've put in your hand is what they originally wrote. Okay, but that's no good if what they wrote isn't what actually happened. So second question, are they people who could have known the truth? Are they people themselves who could have known the truth? So I put a timeline at the bottom of page 2. That's meant to be a timeline at the bottom there. I should say these are not kind of weird right-wing Christian dates. These are scholarly consensus dates for when the books were written. Personally, I would move some of these earlier in history. You'll see Jesus was active in 33 AD. The earliest books in the New Testament are letters, being written from 48 to 60 AD or so, and then Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being written in a period from about 65 AD to 100 AD. So the gap there is, well, 15 years between the letters and Jesus' events. So anybody here with a brother or a sister who is now 15 years old? Anyone do that? There we go. Fantastic. So it's that kind of length in history. So are your parents confused about the birth of your brother or sister? Do they still remember it? Are they, maybe something completely different happened? Maybe they found her on the doorstep and a stork delivered. It's that kind of level of, because we're talking about a man they knew well who was crucified and executed in front of them, who they then saw alive again 3 days later. And it's not the kind of event you would get confused about over time. Or 67 years, which is the kind of latest date. Anyone test for guys, scientists in history? 67 years ago, what was happening in history? I'll give us, it's not a tricky question, it's just a maths question. You should be better at maths than me, even if less good at history. World War II. So 67 years gets us back roughly to World War II. So again, we're the same period of time as Holocaust denial, for instance. So someone today wants to say that the Holocaust didn't really happen, as happened. I was giving this talk once in Oxford, at Oxford University, and the first question out of the box was, but the Holocaust didn't happen, which led to an interesting discussion. But if you want to say the Holocaust didn't happen, you have to deal with the fact that there are people still alive who remember it. So we're in that period of time when they're writing about what Jesus did. So the people who could have known the truth in terms of dating, and their claim is that they were there as eyewitnesses, either personally as eyewitnesses themselves, or that they went round and interviewed eyewitnesses to find out what had happened. And the quote from Luke there tells us that he wasn't an eyewitness, but that he was interviewing eyewitnesses. And that fits the data across the thing. It's clear that they're writing from earlier accounts as well. So it's clear that they have sources behind them. You can work out which sources they have in common and which sources are unique to each one of them. So that gets us back earlier and earlier in time. And it's also clear that they begin talking about these things from the very moment that they happen. So it's not as if Jesus allegedly rose from the dead and then they went and hid in a cave for 15 years and then emerged from the cave saying, oh, Jesus, let me tell you about him. From 40 days after the death of Jesus, they're in public talking about what happened and what they think it's all about. And just to pause there, again, compare with other historical events, just to notice how strong this evidence is. So I studied history as my degree, and I worked out very quickly that the way to have an easy life was to focus. So I focused on 1066, because I already knew what happened then. If you don't, that's the Battle of Hastings, it's kind of important. The sources for the Battle of Hastings, I've written down because I wouldn't otherwise remember them. They're not on your handout, they're on mine in pen. The sources for the Battle of Hastings are William of Poitiers, who wasn't there at the battle. He's biased, he was a big fan of William the Conqueror, but he wasn't there. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, they were there, but they lost the battle, and they write a very brief, very sour write-up about it without much detail. There's the Bayeux Tapestry. Did anyone here been made to go and see the Bayeux Tapestry over in France? Kind of holiday destination. So that was knitted by a bunch of nuns decades and decades later, and they weren't there at the battle either. There were no kind of knitting nuns involved in the battle on the day. William of Jumièges is another source, but he copied it from someone else, and a guy called Orderic also wrote an account, and he wasn't there either. And those are our only sources for what happened at the Battle of Hastings. And that isn't a problem, that is just normal. So to have 4 sources with a degree of independence between them, written for different audiences at different times in different places, writing accounts that corroborate but aren't identical, working from eyewitness material, that is very unusual for even kind of big, significant historical figures that you know and heard of. So that is very good evidence that you could use to work out who Jesus was. What we'd want to ask now is it true? I take it that is the scientific next question, is it true? But it's not really a historical question. We wouldn't normally say, is it true? We'd normally say, do we have reasons to trust it or distrust it? So that's where I want to go next in 2 particular areas. I want to look at internal evidence, reasons to trust them, and then external evidence. Can we check it against external sources? And again, all we're doing there is what you would do very normally with any other historical source. So internally, they give you their aims. So again, under where it says their aims, I've put the quote from Luke again. Luke wants you to know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Or towards the end of John's Gospel that you've got in your hands, he says he's telling you about the things that he saw so that you may believe them. And I think that is very different from how most people who are kind of schooled in England the way I was think about the Gospels. We think that these are fairy stories invented to help children be good, or maybe adults be good if they're stupid ones. So you tell a nice story and think, oh, caring is good, and I'll be caring. Now that may be what you think, but you do the authors no favours by thinking that. They would much rather that you thought they were liars than that you thought they were kind of nice fairy stories. They'd find that patronising. They'd say either disagree with me or believe me. And they intend to give eyewitness evidence to back up extraordinary things that they say they saw happen and that changed their lives. So that's their aims. I think who they are is helpful as well, in that they are a range of people from the very educated to the less well educated, and they're writing, as we said, for a variety of audiences at a variety of times. Their audience is helpful as well. They're writing partly for a Christian audience, but also partly for a non-Christian audience. And their Christian audience, this is where the dating is helpful, includes people who remember very well what actually happened. So they are writing in the lifetime of Jesus' family. They're writing in the lifetime of the early disciples. In fact, the reason they begin writing, the reason for the gap between Jesus and when the first book's being written, the first Gospels in particular, is tied very closely to the point when those people start being killed by the Romans in a persecution. So as the body of eyewitnesses begins not to exist anymore, we need to get this written down. So as they're writing and as they're telling the stories earlier than that, they say that there's people you can go and check with. 1 Corinthians 15 is our earliest account of the resurrection. In a letter he says 500 people saw it happen, and most of them are still alive. Implication, go and ask them if you're not sure. The other group that they're trying to convince are non-Christian people who are not at all disposed to believe in Jesus. So the audience includes the Jewish leaders who killed Jesus and want to do the same to Christians, and the Roman government who just kind of want an easy life, and if necessary will kill Christians to get them to shut up and fit in. And it is in that context that they tell their accounts of what they saw and what they heard, when the people are available to discredit their account by finding mistakes in it. Then turn the page again until it says, can we corroborate their account? Corroborate is a fancy historian's word that I guess you were taught as a way of getting a free GCSE. If you want a GCSE in history, just have to write the word corroborate somewhere and then you get GCSE. It means can we match these accounts to the other data we have from sources and from archaeology. And I'm not going to go through all of it at all. Before I give you kind of a couple of what I think are the most fun bits, we need to remember that from this period in history, we think we have about 1% survival. So in terms of all of the imperial records of government, all of the histories that could have been written, all of the letters and documents going between people, we have about 1% of it. So the library in Alexandria, for instance, was burnt down and destroyed. Everything in it is gone. Whereas some Egyptian rubbish heaps from not very far away have survived. And we've got, and they're mostly shopping lists, scratched on bits of pottery. So we know what people were going shopping for in the market. We don't know what they kept in their fancy library, because it's just things burn, things get destroyed. So, and remember as well, Jesus was not a general. He didn't conquer cities. He wasn't a king. He didn't have an official history written of him in his lifetime. So what we have is what we would expect if these stories were true. In other words, nothing that puts massive holes in it. In fact, lots of things that in different ways back up the truthfulness of the people writing the story. So let me give you two examples. One from Tacitus, who grew up in Rome. He was born in Rome in the early 50s, writes his book in about 115 AD, and writes about the fire of Rome that would have happened when he was about 10 or 11. Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Rome burns down, and Nero, the emperor, is blamed for it, because they say he wanted to just build himself a nicer palace, so he burned the city down. Nero has a kind of public relations problem, and he looks around for a way to fix it, and he chooses Christians as his way to fix it. Again, if London burnt down and David Cameron was looking to pin it on somebody, who do you think he'd pin it on? And again, I don't know quite what you'd say, but Nero finds a group who are hated by other people in the city. A group who everyone will go, oh yeah, that's right, probably the Christians did it. A group that's kind of semi-racist, semi-hated. And he's only able to do that because there are lots of Christians in Rome in 64 AD. So Tacitus isn't a friend to Christianity. He calls it a deadly superstition in the quote I put there. But Tacitus establishes that by 64 AD, so 30 years after Jesus' death, there are enough Christians in Rome that you can blame a political event on them. which tells you that Christianity exploded out of nowhere in ancient history. It is probably the most significant event in world history. You could argue that. The explosion of Christianity out of nowhere. So one dead carpenter in 33 AD has become a global, if you take a kind of Western-centric reading of history for a second, religious movement by 64 AD. Where has that come from? I think that's a normal historical question that anybody, whatever you believe about God, needs to answer. How do you explain the explosion of Christianity out of nowhere? You'll see that Tacitus corroborates lots of bits in the Gospels. So there's a person called Christus, who was the originator of it, who was killed, the extreme penalty, while Tiberius was emperor and Pontius Pilate was procurator. So it's dated to the right moment in history. And the superstition wasn't stopped, but broke out again in Judea and has spread now to Rome as well. So that's a good example of how outside of Christian literature, we can check the details and leave enough of the historical framework there that you need to work out your answer. The Christian explanation, why does it spread? It's because the terrified early disciples met Jesus alive again. That's the believe in God answer to why there were Christians everywhere by 64 AD. If that's not your answer, what is your answer? Why do you think they are there? Why do you think it spread so quickly? And then turn the page again and come to under archaeology. Let me give you just one example. I think it's on page 8. And this is an example of how you don't want to be too hasty arguing from silence. So in John's Gospel, in John chapter 5, there's an event, a miracle that Jesus does at the Pool of Bethesda, and John talks about a sort of 5-arched arrangement around the Pool of Bethesda. And because we hadn't found that in the archaeological records, scholars got very excited, said obviously John is writing much later and has invented the Pool of Bethesda. And they say he could do that because Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, so he's writing in 200, 300 AD, and he's just making it all up. And obviously there's two reasons you can't say that anymore, because we've actually got bits of John's Gospel from 125 AD, so there's no way he's making it up that much later. But even before we had that fragment from 125 AD, that stops being a good argument when in 1888 somebody puts a spade in the right place in Jerusalem and finds 5 arches that fit John's description. So actually it increased, the more we find stuff like that, the more it looks as if these authors can only be people from the period, who knew Jerusalem well before it was destroyed, who are known to the people who were there when Jesus was doing and saying these things, and therefore accredit these people as reliable witnesses, and that what they've given you is what they claim to be a reliable eyewitness account of what happened. Which then, I hope what you'll do from here, well, I hope you'll ask questions straight away, but then beyond that, I hope what you'll do is take away John's Gospel and read it thinking, I wonder why these people thought this was true. I wonder what really happened. They tell you their bias, and I think you could work out what you think really happened. I'm going to pause there. We'll stop for about a minute for writing in questions, if you want to write questions. I'll come around and gather some of those up. Maybe Don will do that too, but you'll be able to ask questions by putting your hand up as well. Should we do that? Yeah, great. Thank you.
So there's a lot of other kind of books historically that are associated with other religions, and I'm wondering, do you have anything that you can say about those that we could almost say the Bible's more reliable than them?
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to hear the question? Lots of religions have books. Do you want to say anything in comparison? I think I want to be cautious speaking outside of area of expertise. I think you'd be well advised to read and come to your own mind on lots of different things. It's not, you don't want to just study one thing and leave at once. I think a couple of things I think and have been told are unique about Christianity and their book. One is that there is a greater degree of historical falsifiability. That's hard to say. As in, Christianity is sometimes understood as a body of teaching attached to a prophet, but that isn't really the way the New Testament authors understand Jesus. He is that, certainly, and there is wise teaching, and he is a prophet, but they understand him as much more than that, as God become a human being who, in the things that he did, transformed the way human beings can relate to God. which means that if those things didn't really happen, Christianity is false and useless. So again, the 1 Corinthians 15 that I mentioned, that is the earliest record of the resurrection, would basically say no resurrection, no Christianity. Whereas the teachings of Confucius, for instance, as I think the details of his life, the things that he did and said, could change dramatically without the value of his teachings changing. Whereas even if Jesus' teachings stay the same, if he didn't rise from the dead, then Christianity is useless, according to the early Christians. I think then there's also something about the degree of evidence for it, which is partly to do with when it happened, I think. Again, so the Roman Empire was a time of rapid communication, of easy to disseminate information, and Christianity emerges ad hoc in that period. So Christianity is not a politically controlled, warlord-driven kind of. There's no leader of Christianity in that sense. Whereas Islam, for instance, is much more organised, I guess you'd say, in a way that Muslim friends would say, yeah, that's a good thing. Whereas Christianity is quite disorganised. There are Christian groups springing up all over the place. They early on have a relationship to the early apostles, but after that there's a kind of high degree of independence and disagreement. In fact, you get quite striking disagreement even within the page of the New Testament, which historically speaking means that you have a wider base of source to come from. So because the manuscripts are good, you can get back to the views of different groups of Christians and compare them to get back to what really happened with Jesus, rather than having an agreed final version issued by a council of leaders or a politically important figure without access to what happened behind it, historically speaking. Doesn't mean that that process couldn't produce truth, but just that Christianity, again, is a bit more falsifiable and rooted out, if you like. Does that make sense? Yeah, thank you. Great question. Does anyone want to come back to that or ask a different question? Happy. Please please take the John's Gospels with you. Please take the boring handout with you and look at it more. So the books I've recommended at the end, the one, A New Eusebius, would be in the King's Library, and probably lots of copies of that. So the sort of the other sources and the early documents, you'd be able to get access to a lot of those by getting hold of that book in the King's Library. Otherwise, hope you're back tomorrow. We'll be looking at, what's the title tomorrow? Does God fit if I'm not even religious? Do religious people have an advantage or a disadvantage? The kind of thing we'll be looking at in here tomorrow at lunchtime. Dom, do you want to say this?